Welcome and thank you for joining us for another Infinity Kingdom guide. Today we are going to have a look at another one of the top builds for Lightning. We are not trying to hard counter anything specific in this build. Instead, I am going to take you through an extremely strong default build for Lightning. This build is a balance of burst, magic, physical damage, defense and utility. Despite being a base build on which you can rely for pretty much everything, it performs very well. If you got the technology and unique artifacts to keep up with, you can contest the biggest of the holy whales as well as heavy earth spenders with this cheap but extremely effective lightning setup. This lightning build is not made to hard counter anything specific. As such, we are balancing between high burst magic damage, consistent physical damage, solid shield sustain, and decent damage mitigation. This is a very strong build to use as your default lightning setup on which you can make small modifications to suit the environment you are in. It is a strong all-around build that will perform well in any encounter, except for fighting bosses. Consider checking out my lightning boss build, the link is in the description. This build performs very well versus pretty much everything out there. This setup can nuke the meta Earth and Earth-Wind hybrid setups very well. Moreover, because we are running wounds, this build will even do a proper dent in a strong holy march and can kill holies if the power disadvantage is not too huge. So, what kind of a budget is required for this build? You can actually unlock both Genghis Khan and Charles via in-game free-to-play events and max them with gems in the marketplace. Hammurabi is technically free to play. But realistically you need to spend a few bucks in the Pearl store to max Hammurabi. While it may be slow, you can technically run this build entirely as a free-to-play player. However, you will obviously get there a lot quicker if you are willing to spend some. Let us have a look at the setup. First things first, we have our 4 Immortals of choice: Genghis Khan, Hammurabi, Peter, and lastly either Charles or Richard. This build relies on Khan and Hammurabi to deal large amounts of damage while being protected by Charles. It also works well, because of how strong the wounds debuff that Khan applies is. Wounds negate 100% of all healing effects on the target. This means, Theodora or Zeno healing is reduced to 0%. Peter is also important to understand. Many will say that El Cid is a strong choice for this spot. But they are wrong. Peter deals very high damage if left alone, and in addition, he brings one of the most underrated utilities in the game: offensive de-spelling. Peter's ultimate ability de-spells all enemies in front of him, removing buffs, shields, graces, etc. from your enemy has a very high impact on your combat performance. But because it does not show as damage numbers, most players make the error of neglecting how extremely powerful offensive de-spelling is. Lastly, Charles is our protector. He brings high-value shields to the setup, keeping us alive. Shielding is the best way to sustain an Infinity Kingdom, simply because it cannot be countered by wounds. Watch out for Peter's though. If you are running Lightning on a tight budget, or just haven't spent enough time grinding yet, then you can go for a Richard version of this build. I have added Richard as an option to the finished build coming up later in this video. To make Richard work, we need to make him stun before our dragon hits with breath. Thus, some changes has to be made to the setup. Moving on to the Tower of Knowledge passive setup you need for this build. For Hammurabi we are simply going all out on max damage. You want to run him with Annihilation, Chase, and Fire Nova. We run Fire Nova because it is excellent at making Chase active, and because it counts as another debuff on our enemies, boosting Hammurabi's damage. We rely on critical hits to cause large amounts of burst damage through Chase procs. If you are below VIP level 13, you will not have sufficient critical hit chance to run Chase. In this case, what you want to do is change Chase into Concentration, or Toxic Nova. Like the Chase passive, Energy Burst is also reliant on consistent critical hits to land. As such the builds coming up will be in 2 versions. The best version is having more critical hit and using both Chase and Energy Burst. But if you cannot get to VIP 13, you want to change a few things. More on that later. You should take note of how powerful VIP 13 is and grind it out, if at all possible. On Genghis Khan, you are going to want as much damage as possible. Genghis Khan's damage comes from his ultimate ability, which we want to cast as often as possible. Therefore, we give him Energy Burst and Death Breath. These two passives in combination with each other is the best energy regen boost in the game. You should also give him Anger, since Khan is our primary damage dealer. If you are below VIP level 13, you may not have enough critical strike chance for energy burst to work right. If that is the case, you can change into Adrenaline Rush instead of Burst. You now have an empty spot on Charles, which should be replaced with Energy Suppression as baseline passive. Moving on. Peter is a physical damage dealer, but he is also taking a lot of damage, especially since you want him facing the enemy physical damage DPS. Peter's attack weakens the enemy in front as well as in the backline facing him. Bringing D spells and damage to the enemy's main damage dealers gives us a huge advantage. We want weakness to boost our critical hits. Moreover, we want to have Fighting Will for control and damage. For the last spot on Peter, you should by default be using Cleave. However, be aware that this last passive slot is highly dependent on your opponent. Peter is very strong, but he is also very squishy with low defensive stats. This is a problem as we need to stay alive to deal damage. If you are facing mainly strong physical marches, you want to do Physical Shield here. If you face strong magic damage, you want to run either Energy Suppression or Resist. If you are up against a balanced magic and physical team and your Peter dies too quickly, you must go for Blessing of Defense. But if you are not really having problems with your Peter being killed fast, you want to stick with Cleave. The choice depends on your enemy composition. For instance, against a Fire Bath Wu build you want Blessing of Defense. But against a Water with Dido Merlin you want Resist. And against Alex Barca Hybrid you want Physical Shield. Last, we have Charles. You want to make sure he is casting shields as quickly and as often as possible. Therefore, he needs to have Adrenaline Rush. Only if you are below VIP 13, as I said earlier, should you run something else here. You also want Charles to provide physical defense from Oakengard, and for the last spot this setup requires Malice, Aura. Malice is great on Charles because reducing the amount of critical hits received makes more smooth and consistent incoming damage. Hence more value from shield-based sustain. What if I have low critical hit chance and no VIP level 13? Well then you have to change some things around. Genghis Khan can no longer run Energy Burst and must instead get Adrenaline Rush in order to consistent reapply wounds and deal damage. This leaves a spot open on Charles, which you want to fill with Energy Suppression by default. This is probably where some of you are asking, what if I cannot run Charles but need to rely on Richard? Richard can work. You should try and build him with Adrenaline Rush and Energy Suppression. There is a chance that you can close a stun in the timing window before Dragon's Breath hits. Therefore, if you run Richard, you should change the default passives a little bit. You want to have Energy Suppression instead of Cleave on Peter. You can now prey on your energy regen technology being strong enough and your enemy's technology weak enough to allow you to stun before immunity. Against anything non-holy, this is still decent passives that will work fine in most cases. But it will not be as strong as the Charles setup. All of this leaves us with two possible setup compositions. First and foremost, the optimal setup where you are above VIP level 13 and have Charles. This is the best setup and you can compete with the strongest players in the game using this march. If you do not have Charles, remember to run Energy Suppression on Peter. Setup number 2. The next best thing, where you are below VIP level 13. This setup is not quite as strong, since you will be lacking some energy regen on Charles or Richard. However, it is still a very powerful build and can definitely compete with most players at endgame. Richard can perform okay against most enemies, however low critical hit means you have to give Khan Adrenaline Rush, leaving Richard to maybe not hit his stun windows. That is it. And here you have it. Lightning built to fit your conditions. This build is amazing to go for as your first lightning build. Once you complete this build, you can begin to modify its composition further to suit the specific needs of the current PvP meta. If you are looking for more advanced lightning builds, check out my guides on Holy Killer Lightning as well as on the next meta setup. Please ring the bell, like and subscribe to the channel. Stay updated on the latest new content and the latest builds by subscribing right here and now. I regularly put out new Infinity Kingdom content. The meta for PvP combat shifts constantly and I am always on to provide you the latest and best builds. Thank you for watching, and see you for the next one.